In the spring of 1847, along the marshy, winding coastline between South Carolina and Georgia, something extraordinary and terrifying began to unfold. The Savannah River, once a serene waterway flowing through lush greenery and vast plantations, became a grim and macabre sight. It started when authorities discovered a body floating on the water, lifeless and cold, its skin pale against the murky currents. The discovery was made just outside of the small port town of Savannah, near a stretch of land known for its swamps and tidal creeks. Local residents, already accustomed to the dangers of such treacherous terrain, assumed it was yet another accident or perhaps a runaway slave who had perished while trying to escape the unforgiving land. But within a matter of weeks, the scene grew far more unsettling. By midsummer, the bodies of 17 more men, each bearing identical marks, were found scattered along the banks of the Savannah River. All appeared to have been killed in similar fashion, their bodies lifeless, their throats bruised, and their faces contorted in silent horror. No one could explain how they came to be there, and no one had seen anything that could offer a clue. In fact, witnesses reported that each death seemed to follow the same eerie pattern. The bodies were always found near water, always with no witnesses, and each victim had been struck down by some unseen force. By the time the bodies reached 43, local authorities stopped publishing the exact count, though rumors spread like wildfire. As the summer months turned to fall, the whispers only grew louder, and a chilling sense of unease crept through the region. It wasn't just the frequency of the deaths that unsettled everyone, it was the distinct pattern of execution. No one could deny that whoever was responsible knew how to move undetected. The bodies showed evidence of deliberate, methodical kills, each victim placed in a position that seemed calculated. At first, it was thought that perhaps some serial killer had taken residence in the area, targeting vulnerable men who worked along the river. But there was something about the way these men died, so far from help, so close to water, that made it feel like something otherworldly was at play. And it was in those early days that the legend of the river ghost began to take shape. Newspaper reports, though careful not to link the deaths directly to one man, hinted at something more sinister. Several accounts mentioned that the victims seemed to die under strange, inexplicable circumstances. Some claimed the bodies were eerily positioned, as though arranged with intent, while others noted the fact that no one could explain the absence of witnesses, even as the deaths became more frequent and more systematic. The local authorities, desperate to make sense of the killings, began to question anyone who might have seen something: neighbors, travelers, even the enslaved populations on nearby plantations. However, despite the intense pressure, no one would speak up. The question on everyone's lips was simple: who could be behind such a brutal, relentless campaign of murder? The mystery deepened when court records, long buried in the Charleston archives, revealed something even more disturbing. It wasn't just that the authorities couldn't catch the killer, it was that no one seemed to even know who he was. In the records, a strange series of testimonies began to emerge. According to the few witnesses who had spoken out, a man was seen near the crime scenes, often disappearing without a trace after each killing. Some described him as tall, dark-skinned, and with an unsettling calmness about him. He moved in ways that made it seem as though he were part of the landscape itself, blending seamlessly into the backdrop of trees, swamps, and mist that surrounded the river. Despite the authorities' best efforts, no one could find this man. His presence seemed to vanish as soon as he appeared. No trace of him remained, no footprints, no blood, no weapon, just the dead bodies left in his wake. The witnesses who had briefly seen him also said that he never stayed in one place for long. He seemed to materialize out of nowhere, and when the killings were done, he disappeared just as mysteriously. As more bodies turned up and local authorities grew increasingly desperate, they started to hear reports from former slaves and other plantation workers that hinted at the identity of the man responsible. Many of them referred to him by name, but when pressed for details, they fell silent. There was no mistake about it. The river ghost was not a mere rumor. He was real, and he was striking fear into the heart of the South. By the time the killings were making national headlines, it became clear that the killer was not just a random murderer, but someone with a specific agenda, someone who knew the land, the people, and the waterways intimately. It wasn't until much later that a chilling connection was made. The victims, all seemingly unrelated, had one thing in common. They were men who had profited from the enslavement of others. Plantation owners, overseers, merchants who bought and sold slaves, and even a federal marshal, all of them were part of the system of oppression that had gripped the South for decades. The more the authorities tried to piece together the puzzle, the clearer it became that the River Ghost was targeting those who upheld the institution of slavery. The man they were hunting, though elusive, was becoming a symbol. Some spoke of him as an avenger, striking back against the system that had long exploited and brutalized enslaved people. To others, he was a figure of terror, an unstoppable force who moved through the shadows, unseen and unheard, dealing out death to those who had long thought themselves untouchable. In the face of this terror, a strange silence settled over the enslaved communities in the area. No one spoke of the River Ghost to the authorities. Not one person, despite the massive rewards offered for information, ever gave the authorities the slightest hint as to the killer's identity. It was as if the enslaved people knew something more than anyone else, a deep, unspoken understanding of who the River Ghost really was. But the investigation continued, and the legend of the River Ghost grew stronger. Throughout the summer and into the fall of 1847, local plantation owners began organizing their own private security forces to guard against further attacks. New patrols were set up along the riverbanks, armed men posted at key locations, and surveillance stepped up in the surrounding swamps, but nothing seemed to make a difference. The killings continued, slowly at first, but with increasing frequency and brutality. A new victim would be found, always near water, always showing signs of a violent death, and still no one could catch him, no one could stop him. The fear was palpable, and yet the authorities could not even find a single lead that would point them to the killer's identity. They were left to wonder whether the River Ghost was even human at all. By autumn 1847, the newspapers had stopped reporting on the exact number of victims, referring only to additional casualties and unexplained deaths. The story of the River Ghost had become too much for the public to digest, and in the wake of so many unsolved murders, the people began to distance themselves from the reality of the terror that had swept through the region. But to those who lived along the Savannah River, to those who worked the plantations, the terror never stopped. The River Ghost had become a figure of myth, a nameless, faceless figure who could strike without warning and disappear just as quickly, leaving nothing but fear in his wake. And yet, no matter how many times his name was whispered in the shadows, no one ever truly knew who he was, and the mystery only deepened. The story of the River Ghost begins, not with violence, but with a transaction, a simple exchange that took place on March 12, 1831, outside the courthouse in Savannah, Georgia. It was an ordinary day by most accounts, the air thick with the oppressive humidity of a spring morning, carrying the mixed scent of salt marsh and sweat. Slaves, recently shipped from the failed tobacco farms in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, stood in rows, their bodies taut with the anxiety of being sold to the highest bidder. Among them was a tall, young man, 23 years old, his name listed in the auction ledger as Samuel Fieldhand, sound constitution, no visible defects. His height, over 6 feet, stood out, an unusual trait in a time when most men were shorter. His back bore scars from previous whippings, but his posture suggested years of hardship had taught him the art of submission, an art of survival. To the auctioneer, a man named Hutchkins, who had spent 15 years selling the lives of men like Samuel, there was nothing remarkable about the young man. The auction itself went on without incident, as routine as any other. What Hutchkins couldn't know, what no one could have guessed that day, was that Samuel was far more than just a piece of property. He was a survivor. Behind his obedient stance, his quiet demeanor, was a mind that had absorbed far more than anyone could imagine. Samuel could read. Not just simple words, but complex texts, written in both English and Gula, the language spoken by coastal slaves. He also knew enough Creek and Seol to communicate with the indigenous people who still roamed the southern swamps, seemingly as much a part of the landscape as the cypress trees themselves. Samuel had learned these skills over years of careful observation and silent study. He had listened to conversations he wasn't supposed to hear, studied maps when the overseers weren't looking, memorized the routines of the slave catchers and the guards that patrolled the plantation grounds. He had learned the layout of his world, every canal, every gate, every watchtower, and he had learned to be invisible in a world where to be seen was to invite pain. The plantation Samuel was sold to, Riverbend, was one of the wealthiest in the low country of Georgia, a sprawling estate of 4,000 acres, set where the Savannah River bent sharply inland. The river created a natural irrigation system, making Riverbend an incredibly valuable property. The plantation belonged to Thaddeus Claymore, a man who considered himself refined for his class, a third-generation rice planter whose wealth was built on the backs of the enslaved. His mansion, grand with its columned portico, overlooked vast fields of rice paddies, canals, and dikes that stretched endlessly, a landscape both beautiful and brutal. Riverbend employed 260 slaves, making it one of the largest operations in the area. Thaddeus Claymore, a man educated at the College of Charleston and a frequent traveler to Europe, prided himself on treating his slaves humanely. He allowed them to marry, maintained family units, and even provided adequate food and shelter, believing that such measures made them more productive. But what Claymore didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that you cannot make slavery humane. You cannot enslave a human being kindly. Samuel arrived at Riverbend in chains, along with 6 other slaves, all recently arrived from the same failed tobacco farm. He was assigned to the 3rd gang, the lowest tier of field workers, given to new arrivals or those who had earned punishment. This gang was overseen by a man named Nathaniel Boone, a seasoned overseer with a reputation for efficiency, who carried a braided leather whip at his belt. Boone's reputation was built on his strict discipline, and his methods were well known. Work too slowly, resist too much, and you felt the sting of the whip. For the first several weeks, Samuel did exactly what was expected of him. He woke before dawn, ate his ration of cornmeal and salt pork, and worked in the rice fields from sunrise to sunset. His hands became raw from the work, his back aching under the weight of the labor, but he did it all without a word. To Boone and the other overseers, Samuel was just another slave, a tall, quiet man who blended into the background like the others who worked the fields. But Samuel was learning, quietly watching and memorizing everything around him. The layout of the plantation, the rotation schedules of the overseers, the paths the slave catchers used, and where the patrol roads ran, all of it went into his memory. For over 3 years, Samuel faded into the landscape of Riverbend, becoming part of the plantation's rhythm. He moved through the estate with mechanical obedience, careful not to draw attention to himself, and learned the subtle patterns of the world that confined him. Other slaves came and went, some died, some were sold, and some tried to escape only to be caught and punished. But Samuel remained, patient, watching, observing. He learned the weaknesses of the overseers, the predictable rhythms of the workdays, the gaps in the patrols, and the flow of water in the canals. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand. He knew the swamps, the hidden places where men could disappear. And all the while he waited. He waited for the right moment to strike back. On August 4th, 1834, everything changed. The first death was an overseer named Horace Gaffney, a man who had worked at Riverbend for 6 years. Gaffney's death, initially thought to be a tragic accident, sent ripples through the estate. He'd been inspecting one of the rice paddies near the eastern boundary of Riverbend when, according to reports, he had lost his footing on the muddy canal bank and fallen into the water, striking his head on a wooden sluice gate. His body was discovered a few hours later by a slave named Marcus, who found him face down in the water. The plantation physician, Dr. Thornbury, who examined the body, ruled it an accidental drowning. Gaffney had slipped, hit his head, and fallen unconscious into the water. It seemed like a simple explanation, an unfortunate accident that could happen to anyone who worked on a plantation. But what Claymore, the doctor, and the rest of the plantation didn't know was that Gaffney had not slipped at all. He had been pushed, and the hands that pushed him, hands that held his head under the water until his struggles ceased, belonged to Samuel. 6 weeks later, a second overseer disappeared, Benjamin Stokes, a young man who had only been at Riverbend for a year. Stokes had been on his final rounds one evening, checking the slave quarters to ensure everyone was accounted for before nightfall. He carried a lantern and a pistol, but he never returned. The next morning, the other overseers organized a search party. They scoured the plantation grounds, checked the fields, the woods and the canals. But they found no trace of Stokes. His horse was found wandering loose, but the man was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything had happened to him. For days they searched, and after a week, The explanation was that he had run away, though it didn't make sense. He hadn't taken his possessions, his horse or anything of value. Some whispered that he had gotten into gambling debts and had fled the area, while others suggested he had drowned in the river, though no body was ever found. No one wanted to consider the possibility that one of their own had killed him, so the mystery remained unsolved. But in the quiet spaces of the slave quarters, the whispers began. Marcus, the man who had found Gaffney's body, mentioned to trusted friends that he had seen Samuel near the canals that day. A woman named Letty claimed she had seen Samuel return to his cabin late one evening, his clothes wet and his hands muddy around the time Stokes had vanished. No one spoke these observations openly or reported them to the overseers. Instead, the understanding spread quietly among the enslaved. Something had changed, someone was fighting back, and that someone was Samuel. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue, unnoticed by the overseers, until it had escalated beyond anyone's control. And Samuel, in his quiet way, was only just getting started. The deaths at Riverbend Plantation were not merely accidents. They were signs of something larger, something that the overseers and perhaps even the slave owners themselves were too blind or too proud to see. The first death, Horace Gaffney, had been written off as an unfortunate slip, a tragic accident. But those who were paying attention, those who had lived through the brutality of slavery, knew better. They understood that something had changed. Samuel, the quiet and observant field hand, had begun to act. The second death, Benjamin Stokes, followed shortly after, and the pattern began to emerge. Each death seemed to strike with purpose. Each seemed to be executed with an uncanny precision. The third death was not an accident. It was calculated. Luther Pettigrew, a notoriously brutal overseer, had made enemies long before Samuel had arrived at Riverbend. Pettigrew was feared by both the enslaved and the other overseers, known for his viciousness, his quick temper, and his eagerness to lash out at anyone who made even the smallest mistake. He ruled over his gang with an iron fist, a man who believed cruelty was the best method for instilling fear and ensuring compliance. He was assigned to one of the remote rice fields near the northwestern corner of the plantation, an area that few overseers dared to patrol alone because of its isolation. Pettigrew, however, was no coward. He believed himself untouchable. On the afternoon of November 19, 1834, Pettigrew had been overseeing the workers in the field, shouting orders and cracking his whip to hurry the men along. He was standing by the edge of a canal when one of the workers, a man named Cyrus, heard his voice rise in alarm, followed by the loud splash of something heavy hitting the water. Looking up, Cyrus saw Pettigrew thrashing in the canal, his arms flailing in the muddy water. Pettigrew went under, then came back up gasping for air, his head going under once more, this time never to surface again. Cyrus dropped his tools and ran toward the canal, as did 3 other workers. They dove into the murky water, frantic in their search, but by the time they found Pettigrew's body, it was already too late. His throat bore deep bruises, and his face was purple, eyes bulging from the pressure of having been forcibly held under the water. The men who hauled him out of the water stood in stunned silence, unsure of what had just transpired. Pettigrew, the overseer who had struck fear into their hearts for years, had died. But how? How could a man so powerful, so ruthless, end up dead in the shallow waters of a canal, with no witnesses to explain what had happened? The county constable, a man named Dwight, arrived soon after, investigating the scene with a determination that betrayed his unease. The workers were questioned, each recounting what they had seen, and each of them told the same story. Pettigrew had been standing by the canal shouting at the men when something happened, something that caused him to fall into the water and struggle for his life. They had heard the splash, but none of them had seen anyone approach Pettigrew. No one had seen him interact with anyone else, and no one could explain what had caused him to fall, nor could they say how he had ended up under the water, held down with such force that even when they found him, it was too late. It was Cyrus, the man who had been closest to the scene, who offered a strange statement when pressed for further details. "Something came out of the water," he said quietly, his voice distant, as though the memory still haunted him. Dwight, unsure of what this could mean, pressed him further, but Cyrus could not explain it in any detail, only repeating that he had heard a shout, followed by the splash, and then witnessed Pettigrew thrashing in the canal. When asked to describe what he meant by "something came out of the water," Cyrus simply shook his head. He didn't know. He couldn't describe it. He only knew that one moment, Pettigrew was standing on the bank, and the next, something had caused him to fall, pulling him into the depths. The constable was puzzled, his report vague, offering only the suggestion that Pettigrew had been attacked and drowned by persons unknown. The investigation was closed, with no explanation and no suspects. The death was ruled an accident, an unfortunate drowning that could not be explained further. The only thing that remained was the strange phrase Cyrus had uttered, lingering in the air. Something came out of the water. Meanwhile, the story began to spread. The deaths, once isolated, were now seen as part of a disturbing trend. Neighboring plantations began to report similar incidents, overseers, slave catchers, and merchants all disappearing under suspicious circumstances. The pattern was undeniable. These men were being hunted, one by one, and always near water. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and no trace of the killer. Word spread through the enslaved communities in hushed tones, whispered in dark corners, in languages that the overseers and owners couldn't understand. The name River Ghost began to circulate, spoken with both fear and awe. The idea of someone, or something, that could move through the landscape, striking down those who had long thought themselves untouchable, was terrifying. But to those who had suffered under the lash of slavery, the thought of someone fighting back, of someone making those men pay for their cruelty, was equally intoxicating. As the deaths continued, the authorities grew desperate. They began to send more patrols to the surrounding areas, bringing in more overseers, more guards, and more soldiers to safeguard the plantations. But it was all in vain. The deaths persisted, with no explanation, no connection between them other than the chilling method of execution, near water, no witnesses, and always the same marks on the victims' bodies. The terror grew, but the authorities, caught in their own web of denial, failed to see the truth that was right in front of them. The River Ghost was not just a myth. He was a man, a force of vengeance, and he was striking back with precision and fury. At Riverbend, Samuel had grown into his role as a quiet observer. He had learned the landscape, understood the rhythms of the plantation, and recognized his enemies. He had become invisible, moving through the estate like a shadow, waiting for the moment when he would strike. Samuel had learned to use the land, the water, and his intimate knowledge of the plantation's layout as weapons. The River Ghost, though feared by the white men, had become a symbol of resistance for the enslaved people. The mysterious deaths were not random. They were deliberate acts of defiance, a rebellion that no one could trace, but everyone felt. Samuel's rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. By the spring of 1835, the deaths attributed to the mysterious figure known as the River Ghost had grown so frequent and unnerving that the once idyllic landscape of the Low Country seemed to tremble with a quiet dread. The pattern had become unmistakable. Overseers, slave catchers, merchants who profited from the slave trade, and even local law enforcement were being picked off one by one, their bodies found near water, in places where the law's reach could never quite grasp. Each death bore the same eerie signature, bruising around the throat, the unmistakable signs of strangulation or drowning, and no evidence left behind to tie the murders to any one person. It was as though the very landscape itself had conspired with the killer, helping him to vanish without a trace. The fear among plantation owners and their employees grew, though they could never quite articulate the reason for it. It wasn't just the frequency of the killings, it was the terror that accompanied them, the feeling that someone was out there watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And yet, the deeper the investigation went, the more elusive the River Ghost became. A new wave of paranoia swept through the coastal plantations as the killings seemed to come without warning. The River Ghost was not like other criminals. He was something else, something more insidious. His victims died in ways that defied reason, in locations that seemed chosen deliberately, places where there was little chance of help arriving and where no one could hear the cries for mercy. The plantation owners, once content to believe in the simple explanations of accidents or runaways, were now gripped by a gnawing sense that something far more sinister was unfolding right under their noses. The dead were not simply victims of circumstance, they were targets, chosen with the precision of a skilled hunter. Samuel, The quiet field hand had become a symbol in the whispers of the enslaved people. The river ghost, the man who struck back against those who had spent their lives committing unspeakable acts of cruelty. But to the men who held power, the landowners and overseers who controlled the region's wealth, Samuel was a threat like no other. He was an enigma, a figure who slipped through their fingers every time they thought they were close. A man who could not be caught, no matter how many men they sent after him. The story of Samuel's rebellion had begun to spread across the plantations, though it was told in hushed voices, in the corners of the slave quarters, passed from one generation to the next like a forbidden legend. His first death, the overseer Horace Gaffney, had been brushed off as an accident. But by the time Benjamin Stokes disappeared, it became clear to the enslaved community that someone, Samuel perhaps, was orchestrating these deaths. They were no longer random or the result of unfortunate accidents. They were a methodical, quiet resistance that had taken root in the very heart of the plantation system. Each death was another blow struck against the men who had once believed themselves to be invincible. The river ghost was not a myth. He was real, and he was coming for them all. In response to the growing panic, plantation owners began tightening their grip on the enslaved population. Slave codes were enforced with an even greater cruelty, the threat of punishment used to ensure that the workers were kept in line. New overseers were hired, men with reputations for being particularly vicious, who were promised high wages and lavish rewards for eliminating the so-called threat. But these men, no matter how well armed or determined they were, found themselves unable to outsmart the river ghost. Patrols were expanded. Armed men were stationed at every corner of the plantation, and the overseers began working in pairs. But it wasn't enough. The killings continued. Each death was like a ripple in a pond, widening the circle of fear until it reached the farthest corners of the plantations. One day, a slave catcher named William Dorch was found dead near the Haywood plantation, 15 miles upstream from Riverbend. He had been tracking a runaway, and his disappearance was reported in the local papers as just another lost soul. His body was found days later, but his disappearance was never fully investigated. Another time, a traveling merchant named Ambrose Talley was found murdered on a back road between two plantations. His throat had been slit with surgical precision, but his money was untouched. The killings were becoming too frequent, too methodical to ignore. But still, there was no one who could point to the killer, no one who could explain what was happening. By the summer of 1835, the mystery had become a full-fledged crisis. The river ghost had become more than just a name. It was a legend, a symbol of something far greater than the individual man who was carrying out the murders. To the enslaved, the river ghost had become an avenger, a force of retribution who could not be stopped. But to the men who were responsible for the system of slavery, he was a menace, an unstoppable force that moved through their world like a shadow, striking when they least expected it. The local constables, sheriff's deputies, and law enforcement officials could not keep up with the murders. One after another, reports flooded in from nearby plantations about new deaths. Overseers, merchants, even a sheriff, each one dying in ways that could not be explained, always near water, always with no witnesses. And still, no one could explain why these deaths were happening or who was behind them. It wasn't long before Samuel's name was whispered in the halls of power. He was a figure who had been sold from plantation to plantation, from one estate to the next, each time leaving behind a trail of mysterious deaths. The authorities had started to notice the pattern, a slave who had been sold repeatedly, always to large plantations in the low country, always in areas where the deaths seemed to cluster. The local authorities, having exhausted all leads, were forced to turn to a man with a different skill set, Federal Marshal Silas Crenshaw. Crenshaw was unlike any lawman the South had ever seen. A man in his 40s, educated and methodical, he saw the killings as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a series of isolated events. He began to piece together a picture that no one had noticed before. Samuel, the quiet field hand who had been sold from plantation to plantation, was the common denominator in a string of unexplained deaths. The more Crenshaw studied the records, plantation ledgers, death certificates, sheriff's reports, the more the pattern became undeniable. It was as if a single hand, a single man, had moved through the plantations, striking only those involved in the slave system, picking them off one by one, each death carefully orchestrated to ensure the system's worst enforcers were eliminated. Crenshaw put his theory to paper, compiling a list of the deaths and sending it to the federal court in Savannah. He called for a warrant to arrest Samuel, but by the time the authorities moved, it was already too late. Samuel, the river ghost, had vanished once again, leaving nothing but fear and bodies behind. The hunt for him would continue for years, but the legend had already taken root. The enslaved communities, knowing more than they ever let on, kept their silence. They never spoke the name of the river ghost to the authorities, not because they feared the punishment that might come, but because they understood something deeper than the men who ruled over them ever could. Samuel wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for something much larger. He was the embodiment of resistance, a figure who could slip through the cracks of the system, leaving behind a trail of terror for those who thought they could never be touched. And as long as Samuel's name was whispered in the slave quarters, there was hope. The river ghost had become more than a man. He was a symbol of vengeance, and he would continue to haunt the plantations as long as the system of slavery endured. By 1836, the legend of the river ghost had spread far beyond the boundaries of Riverbend and the Low Country plantations. Each death left behind a trail of whispered rumors. Each body discovered near the water sparked a frenzy of fear. The terror was palpable among the plantation owners, overseers, and even slave catchers who had once walked the swamps with confidence, believing their power was unassailable. But now, that certainty was being shattered, piece by piece. Whoever the river ghost was, he had proven himself more than capable of evading capture. With every death, he only grew bolder, more elusive, and more dangerous. And Samuel, whether they knew it or not, was at the center of it all, moving from plantation to plantation, like a shadow among shadows, leaving nothing behind but fear and death in his wake. After being sold away from Riverbend, Samuel's journey took him to new plantations, each one ripe for retribution. Though the deaths ceased at Riverbend after his sale, it wasn't long before they began again, this time at Hardesty's Fairview Plantation, 60 miles to the south. In February 1836, a slave catcher named Josiah Merrick was found dead in a creek near Fairview. His body was discovered in water that should have only reached his ankles, yet the man had drowned. His throat bore the same telltale bruises that were becoming familiar to anyone who had followed the pattern of deaths attributed to the river ghost. Merrick's death was the beginning of a new chapter in Samuel's journey. As had happened before, the killings began shortly after Samuel's arrival, and the cycle repeated. 4 men died within a few months, 2 overseers known for their cruelty, a slave catcher who had tracked runaways with vicious zeal, and a constable who had been notorious for his brutal treatment of enslaved people. Each one died in ways that defied reason, drowned in water too shallow to drown in, or found in places where no struggle had been witnessed. It seemed that once Samuel arrived, the men who had made their livelihoods off the suffering of others began to fall, one by one, like dominoes toppling in a chain of retribution. The local authorities were stumped. They had no suspect, no real lead, and no one to interrogate. They turned to the only possible explanation, the river ghost, the name now whispered in every plantation quarter, feared and revered alike. And still, no one spoke. No one among the enslaved population ever offered up any details. The pattern was undeniable. Samuel, or the man they now thought of as the river ghost, was systematically moving through the plantations, finding those who had oppressed his people and bringing them to a brutal, watery end. But there was no way to connect him to the deaths. Samuel had become a ghost, slipping between the cracks of a system that depended on his invisibility, his ability to blend into the landscape like the water he used as his weapon. In 1837, Samuel was sold again, this time to a turpentine camp near Darien, Georgia. The work was different, but no less brutal. Enslaved men carved deep gashes into pine trees to collect the sap, a substance used for various goods, including tar for shipbuilding. The work was isolating, and the overseers were known for their cruelty. One overseer in particular, Raymond Colquitt, had a reputation for extreme violence. He had been known to kill at least 2 enslaved men for what seemed like small infractions, beating them to death with no more concern than if he had crushed an insect. Colquitt's cruelty was infamous among the workers, and to the men who were forced to endure it, his name was a curse. It didn't take long before Colquitt met the same fate as so many others before him. By August of that year, Raymond Colquitt was dead, found at the base of a longleaf pine with his skull fractured. He had fallen from the scaffolding used to climb the trees, but the circumstances surrounding his death were strange, even to those who worked with him. The official report stated that Culquit had simply fallen while inspecting the cuts made in the trees, but those who had seen Samuel watch the overseer knew better. Samuel had been studying Culquit for days, his movements, his patterns, his habits. Samuel had learned the man's routine and found the right time to act. One worker, a man named Abram, who had worked at the camp for 5 years, later told his grandchildren about what he had seen. He had followed Samuel one evening, curious, staying at a distance as he watched him disappear into the forest. It wasn't long before Abram saw Samuel return, calm and collected, while Culquit remained unscathed. The next morning, Culquit climbed the scaffolding as usual, but this time the trap had been set. Samuel had loosened the bolts on the structure, ensuring that it would give way under the overseer's weight. As Culquit fell, he hit the ground hard, his back broken. He gasped for breath, but Samuel was waiting. When he had finally fallen still, Samuel approached, and, with a few cold words that Abram could not hear, turned and walked away, leaving the overseer to die alone. As in all the other deaths, there was no immediate investigation. Culquit's death was ruled an accident. There was no reason to suspect foul play, no one to question, no one who would speak out. For the enslaved people, however, Culquit's death was a symbol. The river ghost was still out there, still striking, still hunting down those who had abused them. In the quarters that night, the name Samuel whispered among the workers, and a quiet understanding spread among them. Their tormentor had been removed from the world, and for one brief moment, justice had been served. And it had been served by a man who, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. Samuel had become an instrument of justice, in the cruelest sense of the word, his actions sending shockwaves through the system of slavery. By 1839, Samuel had moved again, this time to a rice plantation on Edisto Island. The deaths continued to follow him. In 1841, he was sold to a cotton estate near Brunswick, Georgia, and once more, the deaths resumed. As before, the targets were always the same: overseers, slave catchers, merchants, and anyone else who profited from the misery of others. The pattern was unmistakable. Each time Samuel arrived, the men who had made their fortunes from slavery died under mysterious circumstances, drowned in shallow water, struck down by accidents that were too calculated to be coincidence, and always near the water. The river ghost had become a name feared across the low country, a symbol of a rebellion that could not be contained, no matter how much power was thrown against it. With each death, the tension grew. Plantation owners began to hire private security forces, hoping to protect their holdings from the mysterious figure who haunted their estates. But none of it worked. The river ghost continued to strike, his presence felt in every corner of the plantation system. The death toll rose, but no one was ever able to stop him. The authorities had begun to close in. A federal marshal named Silas Crenshaw had started to investigate the pattern of deaths. He reviewed court records, spoke to plantation owners, and pieced together the puzzle that no one else had seen. In 1845, Crenshaw filed a request for a warrant to arrest Samuel, presenting evidence that pointed to him as the killer behind the mysterious deaths. But when the authorities arrived at the plantation where Samuel had been working, they found that he had vanished once again. His few belongings remained behind, nothing more than a blanket, a spare shirt, and a wooden bowl. But Samuel himself was nowhere to be found. The manhunt was launched, but it was fruitless. Samuel had disappeared like smoke, and no one could track him. Weeks passed, and Crenshaw's investigation turned up nothing. The federal authorities offered rewards, organized search parties, and even brought in tracking dogs. But Samuel had become like the river itself, constantly shifting, constantly out of reach. Then, in October 1845, Crenshaw himself was found dead, his neck broken, his body discovered in a ravine near the Altamaha River. The cause of death was ruled an accident, but the locals knew better. The river ghost had struck again. The man who had come closest to capturing him was now a victim, and the hunt for Samuel would continue until it stopped altogether. Samuel, if he was even still alive by then, had become a ghost in history, his name fading into the shadows, the legend of the river ghost becoming nothing more than a whisper. But to the enslaved, to those who had known his name and understood his purpose, Samuel had become something far more than a killer. He was a symbol of resistance, a figure who had struck back when the world seemed to have no other hope. And as long as his story was passed down, as long as the name River Ghost lived on in the memories of those who had suffered, his legacy would never be forgotten. The River Ghost, whether real or imagined, had changed the way the South remembered its history, and even if Samuel himself disappeared into the fog of time, his vengeance would echo across the generations. As the 1840s gave way to the 1850s, the South was in the midst of a cultural and political shift. Tensions between the North and South had reached a boiling point, and the debate over slavery was tearing the nation apart. Southern plantations, once the engines of wealth and power, now found themselves at the epicenter of a national crisis. The economy, driven by the labor of the enslaved, was propped up by a system that was under growing threat. And in the midst of this turbulence, the legend of the River Ghost, the man who had haunted the plantations, bringing terror and death to the enforcers of the slave system, continued to grow. Samuel, who had moved from one plantation to the next, systematically eliminating the men who upheld the institution of slavery, was now a figure whispered about in the halls of power. His name was on the lips of fearful plantation owners who feared not only for their property but for their lives. His acts of violence, each one seemingly random yet deliberate, had made him a symbol of vengeance for the enslaved people of the South. Yet, with the growing chaos of the 1860s, as the nation slipped further into division, the presence of the River Ghost began to fade. In 1861, the South made its fateful decision: secession from the Union. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, and with that, the South was plunged into a brutal conflict that would claim the lives of over 600,000 Americans in the coming years. As the war raged, the South's labor force, the very foundation of the plantation economy, began to disappear. Men who had once governed the vast estates left for the front lines, joining the Confederate Army in droves. Overseers enlisted, while slave catchers, merchants, and lawmen who had once ensured the system of slavery remained intact, now found themselves sent off to fight in a war that would determine the future of the country. With the Confederate Army drawing away the very men who had upheld the system, a vacuum of power began to form. Slave patrols dissolved, the tight rein on the enslaved loosened, and with it came a sense of chaotic freedom. The very system that had given rise to the River Ghost began to crumble piece by piece. The war, however brutal, had brought a strange form of liberation, not only for the enslaved, but also for the man who had become their symbol of resistance. Samuel, the River Ghost, had no need to operate in the same clandestine manner now. With the Confederacy in disarray and the nation at war, his actions would be swallowed by the chaos of battle and bloodshed. While the conflict raged on across the country, the deaths attributed to the River Ghost seemed to pause. No longer were there bodies of overseers or slave catchers found near the water. No longer were there reports of men disappearing without explanation. The death toll that had once climbed steadily began to slow, as the very system that had sustained it faltered under the weight of war. But even as Confederate forces scrambled to maintain order, the legend of the River Ghost persisted. He was not forgotten. As the war dragged on, a strange resurgence in reports began to emerge, although they came from the Confederate military itself. In 1863, a Confederate colonel named Marcus Talbot, stationed in the coastal region of Georgia, wrote to his commanding officer in Richmond, describing what he referred to as a persistent problem among his men. Over the past 6 months, Talbot reported, more than 20 Confederate soldiers, pickets, sentries, and couriers had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The deaths occurred in isolated areas, far from the main Confederate lines and always near water. The manner of death mirrored that of the earlier killings attributed to the River Ghost: bruising on the throat, a strangled or drowned man, no sign of struggle, and no witnesses to explain what had happened. Talbot's report was a plea for action, but what struck him the most was the fear among his men. The soldiers were convinced that a local man, one of the enslaved, was responsible for the deaths, though they could not identify him. The men had given this figure a name, the River Ghost, and some of them were so convinced of his existence that they refused to go on patrol alone. They had heard the stories, and the sight of the bodies was enough to convince them that death itself was stalking them in the swamps and marshes. The colonel's letter was filed away with little fanfare, ignored in the face of greater military priorities. The war was becoming more desperate, and with each passing day, the Confederacy was losing ground. Talbot's request to organize a manhunt for the River Ghost was denied. The war was consuming resources, and the deaths of a few soldiers in the swamp were deemed insignificant compared to the larger battles being fought on the front lines. Still, the name lingered: the River Ghost. The men of the Confederate Army could not forget the terror, nor could they ignore the fear that gripped them when they ventured too close to the water's edge. Some began to question whether this was all just a myth, a story spun by the men who feared the vast, mysterious landscape. Others, however, believed it to be very real, a haunting presence that had never left. As the war continued into its fourth year, the Union forces pushed deeper into Georgia, threatening to break the Confederate hold on the region. With the arrival of Union troops, the power structures of the South began to fracture irreparably. The Confederate Army became increasingly disorganized, and the chaos on the home front was mirrored on the battlefield. Many plantation owners had already fled to the safety of Confederate-controlled cities, abandoning their estates as Union forces advanced. The once orderly system of control, the overseers, the slave catchers, and the lawmen, had evaporated, leaving behind a power vacuum that no one could fill. The enslaved people, freed by the chaos of war, moved throughout the South in search of their loved ones, in search of a life beyond the plantation. By 1865, as the Confederacy's defeat became inevitable, and General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse marked the end of the Civil War, the River Ghost faded from the spotlight. The killing had ceased, and the plantations, once sites of constant tension, had been abandoned or burned. No longer was there any reason for Samuel, or whoever had been the River Ghost, to strike. The war had brought an end to the system of slavery, and with it, the need for a vengeance-driven figure like the River Ghost dissipated. Samuel, if he had survived the chaos of war, disappeared as completely as he had arrived. The legend of the River Ghost slowly faded, becoming little more than a ghost story whispered around campfires and passed down through generations. For many, the name of Samuel, if they ever knew it at all, was lost to history. Yet, even after the war had ended and slavery was abolished, the memory of the River Ghost lived on in the stories told by those who had lived through the dark days of the South. The enslaved, who had once feared him, now looked upon him as something different, perhaps even as a hero, a man who had dared to fight back when the system had crushed so many others underfoot. To them, Samuel was not a monster but a symbol of resistance, of the quiet defiance that had endured even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. As the nation entered the period of Reconstruction, the once powerful men who had ruled the South now found themselves stripped of their wealth and power. The legacy of slavery was being slowly dismantled piece by piece, but even as the country moved toward a new future, the figure of the River Ghost remained. His actions, his legacy, a reminder that sometimes justice, when denied by the law, takes on a different form. Samuel's story may have ended in the fog of history, but the impact of his rebellion and the fear he struck into the hearts of those who profited from human suffering continued to echo long after the war had ended. The River Ghost had changed the South forever, and his story would live on, no matter how many years passed, no matter how much history tried to forget him. By the summer of 1877, more than a decade had passed since the end of the Civil War, and the South was struggling to rebuild itself in the aftermath of destruction. The system of slavery that had defined the region for so long had been abolished, but the scars it had left on both the land and the people were still deep. Plantation owners who had once profited from the forced labor of the enslaved now found themselves faced with the daunting challenge of adjusting to a world where their wealth and power no longer held sway. The government, still in the throes of Reconstruction, struggled to bring about true change, while many former slaves sought to rebuild their lives in freedom. Amid this chaotic and painful period, the story of the River Ghost, of Samuel, the man who had vanished into the shadows after bringing retribution to those who had upheld the system of slavery, had become little more than a memory, a legend. But as the years passed, whispers of Samuel's deeds, of his vengeance against the overseers, the slave catchers, and the brutal merchants, remained alive, passed down in hushed tones, especially among the descendants of the enslaved. In the small, tight-knit communities of freedmen scattered across the South Carolina and Georgia lowlands, the name Samuel was spoken with reverence, though few knew the details of his life. He had become a ghost, a symbol of resistance, a figure that existed only in the shadows of memory. His legacy, born of violence but shaped by the necessity of that violence, persisted in the folk stories told by elders to their children and grandchildren. Samuel's name had become synonymous with hope and vengeance, a reminder that even in the darkest days of slavery, the oppressed could fight back, could exact justice in a world that refused to give it to them. One summer evening, a man who had grown old in the years following the war arrived at a small freedman settlement on St. Helena Island, South Carolina. His arrival went largely unnoticed at first. There were no fanfare, no special attention paid to him. He was just another old man, one of the many who had lived through slavery, who had worked the land and survived the brutality of a system that had tried to crush the human spirit. This man was different, though. He was tall but stooped with age, his hands gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor. His white hair and deeply lined face spoke of a life that had seen far too much suffering, too much hardship, too much silence. His gait, though slow and measured, held a quiet strength that was unmistakable, as if his bones carried the weight of the years, but his spirit was still unbroken. When the man arrived, the community welcomed him with caution. The newly freed people were still vulnerable, still on guard after the years of violence and oppression they had endured. They were unsure of this stranger, who spoke little and revealed little about himself. He moved into an abandoned cabin on the edge of the settlement, quietly fixing the roof, patching the walls, and making it livable again. He didn't mingle much with the community, and while the younger folk found him odd, the older generation treated him with a kind of reverence. There was something about him, a presence, a quiet authority, that set him apart. For months the old man lived in the settlement, keeping to himself, fishing in the nearby creeks, tending a small garden behind his cabin. He never spoke of the past, never revealed his true identity, but there was a restlessness about him, an unspoken weight that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The younger people, curious about his past, whispered among themselves. Some believed he had once been a slave, others thought he might be a runaway from another plantation. But no one could say for sure. All anyone knew was that he was a man who carried his history with him, but whose history remained locked away behind silent eyes. One evening, while sitting around a fire in the settlement, a group of younger men began to talk about the old days, the days when they had been enslaved, and the men who had ruled over them with cruelty. One man named Isaiah spoke up, recalling the plantation where he had been forced to work as a child. He spoke of a particularly brutal overseer named Thaddeus Claymore, a man who owned a plantation near Savannah, Georgia, and had been notorious for the violence he inflicted on the enslaved people. Isaiah described how 3 overseers had died while he was there, each one mysteriously disappearing or meeting a gruesome end. He said, "I remember his name, Claymore. He was a cruel man. I saw 3 overseers die while I was there, and Claymore, he never seemed to care. He'd just hire new ones." From the shadows, the old man's voice interrupted the conversation. Claymore drowned in 1852, fell into one of his own rice canals during harvest season. They said it was an accident, that he slipped on the muddy bank and hit his head. By the time they pulled him out, he had been underwater for over 20 minutes. They buried him with a nice stone marker next to the other overseers. Isaiah froze, his words caught in his throat. The firelight flickered in the man's face, casting shadows that seemed to deepen the mystery of his words. The others looked at the old man, sensing something familiar in his voice, but unable to place it. Isaiah spoke again, his voice tinged with disbelief. "How do you know that? That plantation was in Georgia, near Savannah. Were you there?" The old man smiled, a distant, knowing smile, as though the years had brought him a kind of peace, but also a strange sense of quiet satisfaction. "I was there," he said softly. "I was standing right next to the canal when it happened. In fact, you might say I helped him fall." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken understanding. The younger men stared at him, wide-eyed, as the weight of his words settled in. They had heard the stories, of course, the legends of the river ghost, the man who had struck down the overseers and brought terror to the South's ruling class. The old man's words seemed to confirm what they had only heard in whispers. He had been there. He had been the one to push Claymore into the water, to end the reign of one of the most brutal men to have ever worked the fields. As the night wore on, the conversation turned away from the past, and the old man quietly retreated back to his cabin. No one followed him. No one asked him to explain further. He had spoken only a few words, but those words had confirmed something that had been long believed in the hidden corners of the enslaved community, that the river ghost, the man who had brought justice to the unjust, had lived among them and perhaps still lived among them. In the years that followed, the old man continued his quiet life in the settlement. He never spoke of his past again, never revealed more of his story. He lived simply, helping when he could, never drawing attention to himself, but always carrying the knowledge of the past in his eyes. And in 1883, the old man died peacefully in his sleep. When he passed, the community buried him in the small cemetery, just another body among many, but this one marked only by a simple wooden cross, no name carved into it. The next morning, 3 very old women, all survivors of slavery, stood by the grave. They had known the truth. They had lived through the fear, the violence, and the silence. One of them, a woman named Esther, who had been born on a rice plantation in Georgia, looked down at the fresh earth and said quietly, "He was the river ghost, wasn't he?" The other 2 women didn't answer directly. But one, a woman named Denina, who had seen many years of suffering, said simply, "Whoever he was, he did what he had to do. He survived, and he made some of them pay for what they did to us. That's all that matters." Rebecca, the 3rd woman, nodded slowly. "Some stories," she said, "ain't meant to be told complete. Some stories are better left with questions at the end. Let the white folks wonder. Let them ask themselves if it was real or not. Let them feel a little bit of what we felt all those years, not knowing, being afraid, wondering when something might come out of the darkness for them." And with that, the women turned and walked away, leaving the nameless grave behind them, carrying their knowledge with them. The truth, like the river itself, flowed silently beneath the surface, known to those who had lived through the terror, but left unspoken for all others. The river ghost's story ended in silence, but his legacy lived on, quiet, powerful, and untold in its entirety. Some stories are meant to remain hidden, their truth too powerful, too dangerous to be fully revealed. Samuel, the river ghost, had fought for justice when no one else would. And though the world would never know the full extent of his actions, those who survived the darkness knew that the legend of the river ghost was not just a tale, it was a truth that would live on forever.